Good afternoon, everybody. Let's take a second to pay tribute to our founding fathers who created one of the most important documents, the Constitution of India, and ensured adult franchise for all. Welcome to session number 85, Karma, the Landscape of Desire. Indian civilization and culture has a distinct place for karma, for desire and pleasure as one of the goals of life. I would like to welcome Madhavi Menon, author of Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, and Gurcharan Das, author of Karma, The Riddle of Desire, in conversation with Malashri Lal. This session is presented by DMI Finance.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a session on desire, but right now what I see from my seat here and through the door is that a desire of a lot of people wanting to come and attend the session. So just give us a minute or two till people either find their way here or can't find their way here, and we'll begin immediately then. I leave it to the organizers to do whatever they think best.
But Mala, let's...
Yeah, I know. We should let the people settle down.
There's a lot of room up here.
Let them. So clearly this is a subject very close to the heart of everyone, and I have two marvelous books and eloquent speakers. I've had the privilege of discussing this book with Gurcharan on 2 occasions in Delhi. Madhavi I've known for a while, but this is the first time that we're interacting on this particular book, and I'm surely looking forward to what you have to say on the subject on which you have written. In some ways, the books are different and similar in other ways. The common subject is desire, but the 2 books show that you can approach it very differently. Madhavi's is documentation narrative, if one can call it that, and Gurcharan's is a philosophical novel. From my use of that vocabulary, you can see that both these books escape any kind of understood genre. And Gurcharan and I had a hearty debate as to what do you call a novel? And how can you have a category such as a philosophical novel? So in the course of our discussion, I'm sure Gurcharan is going to talk about crossing that boundary between philosophy and novel. When it comes to Madhavi, the book is called Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India. Now, the term history, of course, is fraught with many troubles right now. So this is history of another kind, where she's looking at visual art, interviews with people, has wandered around in many parts of India, small towns, young people, old people, just exploring what the term desire means. So I think we are pretty much settled now into the session, and those who could make it inside are here, and those who couldn't have melted away. So what else can they do, really? So Madhavi, I'm going to ask you to read the first few lines of your book, because it has a wonderful dramatic beginning and makes the point that desire is not something new, nor is talking about desire something new. It's always been present in our culture, and we often make the mistake of thinking that debating and analyzing desire is a Western phenomenon, it's a new phenomenon. Actually, Madhavi's book shows that it's one of the oldest ideas and concepts, and in fact, analysis too. So do read the beginning. How far do you want me to read? About 2 paragraphs. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay.
Thank you, Mala. Thank you, Gurcharan. It's wonderful to be here with all of you as well, crowded into this tent, which feels very intimate, which, of course, is one of the adjectives one can associate with desire. And this is a bit of a surprise. I hadn't known Mala was going to ask me to read out loud. And I'm actually going to be reading from my introduction at a later session today as well. So if you want to come for the later session too, you can come maybe 5 minutes late and miss this part of it. But I'm just going to read out the first couple of paragraphs as Mala. Just the first two, tiny paragraphs. It'll take about 10 seconds. And this is the introduction to the book, and the introduction also has a title. It's called A History of Impurity. And it goes like this. And I begin by talking about the cover of the book, which some of you can see here, and you can see it in the bookstore and elsewhere as well. Two women sip wine as they caress one another. All around them is beauty and light. They enjoy the revels with abandon, their jewels sparkling, and look straight at the artist who is putting up their image for posterity. People from around the world will see this image and wonder at its sensuality. An Instagram photo taken in one of the metropolises of the world in the 21st century, you think? No. Try an 18th century painting from rural Rajasthan.
Thank you, Madhavi. I just wanted to share those two dramatic paragraphs because we're in Jaipur. Samod, from where this painting is only 40 kilometers away, if you want to go check it out. And this is so particularly exciting about the book that Madhavi has written, that she explores and strings together completely unexpected representations of desire. So we have the celibate god, Ayappan, who is worshipped by Hindus as well as Muslims, as you know. And we know about the shrine in Sabrimala and what's been going on there. So this has opened up new debates on sexuality on old premises. So that's one of the things to explore. And Madhavi, you've also written about public parks, how desire is expressed there. These are sites of social change. Women are more visible in public spaces. And private spaces have shrunk in many ways. So how do public parks come into this discussion on desire? So how are you able to cover this enormous range in a single book? And you've done it with great finesse and wonderful organization.
Thank you. I think one of the premises for this book is that when we talk about desire, we're not talking about anything esoteric or secret or unknown or out of our grasp. When we're talking about desire, we're talking about things that drench our lives every single day. Every single minute of every single day, we are always making decisions or are the products of decisions made in relation to desire. And so one of the main arguments of my book is that I like to think about everyday objects and how they interact with desire. So as Mala said, I have a chapter on parks, I have a chapter on hair, I have a chapter on education, and all these everyday sites and ideas that we don't necessarily relate to desire, for me become interesting because they are very much affected by our ideas of desire. So just to sort of talk about the parks for a minute, what's fascinating about parks, and I write about several of the parks in Delhi, but I think this is true for parks everywhere in the world actually, is that it straddles a difficult and interesting line between the so-called public and the so-called private. So it's a public park when you have sort of an open walking track or a running track and people are sort of jogging around there, walking around there. And then, especially in India, you have all these bushes, and what goes on behind the bushes might be termed private. But is it private-public, public-private? How do we draw that line? And what's interesting to me about that conversation is that all big decisions, whether it's the Supreme Court decision on 377 or adultery or anything of the kind, all these decisions hinge on how we understand that line between public and private. And so for me, parks become a really excellent and interesting location to think about how we might adjudicate that difference, if that difference actually exists. Because as you know, even the Supreme Court reading down 377 has agreed to accept consensual acts between adults in private. So there is this entire thing about, we have lots of laws in this country against public obscenity, sort of public displays of affection. And so it's very interesting to think about what is public, what is private, because arguably, nothing is more public in our country than desire, right? I mean, just think of the size of the shadis we see around us. I mean, when we checked into the Marriott the other day, there were 3 big wedding help desks. So you could actually go to a help desk for a wedding, not to get married, but to sort of attend the wedding that you're attending. So desire is this intensely public phenomenon. Yet we insist on thinking and acting as though it is private. And that sort of speaks to an interesting psychology as well. So for me, the landscape of desire is very broad, very everyday, very recognizable.
Yes, Parks is one wonderful example. And you referred to mythology. And there's a fantastic chapter on hair, which again is not only part of our very popular mythology, but also part of our everyday lives. I mean, beauty parlors, mushrooming in every single lane, hair being quite an obsession with all of us who have to sit on the stage. So, this essay, I'm going to quote a little bit from your essay on hair, and you say, Madhavi, hair has been a marker of sexual attractiveness in India across gender and across religions. If anything, hair has functioned in all the major religions of the world as the most potent symbol of desire. And then, Madhavi, you go on to cite examples from Mir Taqi Mir's Persian poetry, examples from the sculptures of Khajuraho temples, also wonderful hairdos that people are copying now at weddings. And then beauty parlors, and now for the metrosexuals in urban India, there are special parlors. Now, in mythology, and that's my special area of interest, perhaps the most famous example is that of Draupadi. And we remember, of course, that after the game of dice, Draupadi is dragged into the court by her hair. And and it is Dushasan who insults her. And Krishna comes to her rescue when the attempt is made to disrobe her. But on the other hand, her hair is a very important part of that narrative. And her Draupadi's loose hair, in fact, as Madhavi says, becomes a central concern. It's a marker of her sexual humiliation. But also, it's a marker of her pride. Because she says, I will never tie up my hair again unless it is bathed in the blood of Dushasan. So this kind of exploration of hair from mythology to modern times, would you like to comment and analyze this a little further? Because you also theorize out of the practices that you are putting before us in the book.
I mean, I was just struck, Mala, when you were reading that Dushasana's blood could very well be a new hair care product that that we sell, because it's meant to sort of restore vitality to Draupadi. But what interests me about Draupadi's hair, but about hair in general, not just the way in which its length is policed. Increasingly in the subcontinent today, right, women are encouraged to have long hair as a marker of beauty. Men, of course, are encouraged to have short hair. And so on and so forth. If a woman starts losing her hair, it becomes a disaster. If a man starts losing his hair, it's less of a disaster, shall we say. And so there is a way in which hair becomes an extremely gendered marker of difference now, which is increasingly being policed. But what's interesting to me is it's not just the length of one's hair that is important to desire. It's also what one does with that length. And so Draupadi, for instance, and to me this is what makes her hair interesting, is married to 5 different men. And so there have been, many people who've written about the sort of the assumptions behind her, of her sex life, of being married to 5 different people. And the loose hair, to this day, becomes a signifier of a loose woman. So if you have loose hair, that means you are sexually available, or even more damningly, and I mean damningly in quote marks because I don't agree with it, even more damningly, someone who enjoys sexual pleasure. Whereas tied up hair, and in all the calendar art you will see this, once you are married, you're meant to tie up your hair. So you're meant to sort of contain your sexuality. And so the hair becomes a metaphor for what is going on in your sex life. And so loose hair becomes, open door policy. Tied up hair means you're sort of stayed and settled. And this becomes something that we don't even think about when we make our everyday decisions about hair. But it's something that has percolated so deep into our psyche that we don't even need to think about it, right? This is how norms work, that they pretend that they are natural, and so we don't even have to think about it. But one of the points in my book is that there's nothing natural about this. This is something we have been taught for many centuries through literature, mythology, religions, to think about sexual licentiousness and sexual prudery as it is mapped onto the body.
Gurcharan, I'm going to request you to come into the discussion with your wonderful book on karma. The hidden part of that title might be Kamasutra, the sutra part of it. And back again to mythology, you remember that the god of love, Kama, is without body because he disturbed Shiva when he was in deep tapasya. And then Shiva was so angry at being disturbed in his meditation that he opened his third eye and he burnt up Kama, right? And then when Parvati pleaded on behalf of Kama and said, please restore him, how can the world continue without desire? Then he said, look, I can't do anything about it. You know, it's happened, but okay, Kama, desire can exist, but without body. So Kama, in other words, pervades everything here. It's all around us, invisible, but always there. Now, your book deals with not only that aspect of absent present desire at all times, but you've placed the philosophy of desire within an imagined fictional context. And your protagonist is Amar, who's a senior citizen, if I might say. But the senior citizen has not lost desire. In fact, is a great mind that analyzes desire. But let me request you to talk a little more about your novel, philosophical novel, book of ideas. I'm not sure how I could categorize it. A wonderful book, though massive. I couldn't put it down once I started reading it.
Well, in another way to think of it is it's a biography of an emotion. And you can only write about desire or karma through a story. I think a philosophical tract would not do justice to it, and that's why I chose the idea of a fictional memoir. And the narrator, so that's just to give you an idea how it works, that the narrator is an older man. He's recalling his life, and he says, my first memory of desire was when I was 4 years old, and I woke up suddenly one morning at dawn. It was cold, and I felt lonely, and I ran to my mother's bed and jumped in and nestled beside her and fell fast asleep. And then a little bit later, he stops this story, and he says, now he's the narrator, and he's commenting on what's going on. And he says, well, desire strikes early in life, but it can also strike early in a civilization. And he says that unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition of the West, where in the beginning was light, in the Rig Veda, in the beginning was desire. And the cosmos was created from the seed of desire in the mind of the One. And so our ancients, he's asking the question, what does it say about a civilization where in the beginning was desire? And then he recalls that our ancients actually realized that desire is the source of all action. You wouldn't wake up in the morning if you didn't feel desire. It's the source of creation. It's the source of procreation. And so they realize that it's the animating principle of life, and the living cell would die without desire. And so and very soon he's talking about now, he's talked about the creation, the origin of the universe, but now he's talking about the creation of the species. How did humanity and come about. And there's not in the Rig Veda, but in the Atharva Veda, there's a wonderful account of, and this is now Prajapati, who feels desire. I mean, he feels lonely. And one of the running themes, I think, in our classical literature is that the great pleasure that we get from sex is in some ways a recompense for the loneliness of the human condition. And so he's talking about the Prajapati, and Prajapati is big, so he cuts himself into two, and a woman is created, and he feels desire for the woman. He runs after her, but she says, hang on, you just created me. You're my father. And so she turns into a doe, he becomes a deer, they copulate, and that's how the deer population is created. Then she becomes a cow, and he becomes a bull, and the cow population is created, and human beings, and all the way down to ants. And so I think what's the way I go about it is precisely it's an education of the narrator in all facets of desire. And I was just thinking in my mind that one of the running sort of themes in the book is the conflict between Dharma and Karma. You know, this book is the third in the trilogy. That the first book was Artha, India Unbound. Second was Dharma, the difficulty of being good. And this is Karma, the riddle of desire. And the thing that why that matters is that there is a constant conflict between these various goals of life.
But I'm going to come in a little bit to also point out to our audience members that your book is well beyond India. So it's a discussion of desire in the context of all the philosophical discourses that are available in Western literature, major thinkers. And I was very struck by the numerous sources that have been brought into this story. Here is a select list. There is Proust, a lot of Proust in the book. There's Tolstoy, Chekhov, Balzac, Shakespeare, and I'm only naming a few. And then there are the theoreticians of desire, for instance, Freud and Foucault. So it's an enormously rich canvas of desire. Now, reflecting back on the earlier points made with Madhavi, see, we often think that the notion of desire in India is different than the notion of desire in the West. But what Gurcharan's book is perhaps presenting to us is the possibility that desire is such a fundamental emotion that all civilizations have had to deal with it at all times and come up with their own iconographic and metaphoric solutions. So would you like to comment on that, the Western sources that you brought into your story?
Yeah, and you know, I think you may have scared some of the people in the audience by naming Proust and Shakespeare and Tolstoy and Chekhov. The way these sources work is at various times the narrator's story. For example, he's feeling jealous. Now, the greatest work on jealousy is Proust's novel, The Remembrances of Things Past, or In Search of Lost Time Now, or Othello, you know. So it's a kind of a seamless flow. That's what I wanted to suggest, and not scare people here. But I thought that, I mean, India is the only civilization that elevated desire to a goal of life. I used to believe that the secret of happiness was to love the work you do and love the person you live with. But then when I started doing research on the classical tradition, I realized that actually the artha, dharma, kama, moksha, the rich, the fulfilled life, the flourishing life has these in balance. And one of the problems that constantly comes up in the book is what we call a dharma sankat, which is a moral dilemma. And I just thought I would illustrate one moral dilemma.
The extramarital affair.
Yes.
Okay.
So the protagonist, the narrator, he is now in his 40s. He has had a very fine marriage. He has 2 lovely children. But desire has waned in his life. And this is something inevitable. And in fact, the cover of my book, it really illustrates to you the 4-5 stages of desire. I don't know if you can see it. Maybe you can hold.
It's on the screen. Let me hold it for you.
Yeah. Oh, it's on the screen. Okay. So you see the first flower. These are, by the way, the flowers are the arrows that the god Kama shoots at his victims. And in fact, Shashi Tharoor actually proposed this idea that we should change the name of Valentine's Day to Kama's Day, Kama Deva Divas. And we will actually take the wind out of the sails of the Hindutvas. So Kama has a bow made of sugar cane, and the string is made of honeybees, and he shoots these arrows at his victims. And this is when the first meet. The white lotus is fascination, when the 2 people meet. Then the red flower, the Ashoka tree, is the moment when they decide to do something about it. And then there is the jasmine flower is intimacy. And that intimacy often translates into marriage. And then after long years of hard work of bringing up children, fighting, following a career, running the house, the desire wanes. And you're in the 4th stage of desire, which is the blue lotus. And this is the challenging moment where the protagonist is. 5th, by the way, is the death of desire, and that is the sandalwood flower. So the narrator now is in the 4th stage of his life. And he comes to work one day, and he's feeling very discontented. And he says, "Is this all there was to life?" And then a week later, he gets on a train. And those of you who know Bombay, there's a train called the Deccan Queen, which goes from VT to Pune. And a few minutes later, a woman comes and sits nearby in the same train. And they're like civilized passengers. They have a sort of impersonal conversation in the beginning. Slowly, the conversation becomes more intimate. And soon, there's very clear, there's electricity around them and desire. And before the end of the journey, it's quite clear that they're attracted to each other and they could have an affair. And what goes on in his mind, I think, is important. So he thinks, if I have the affair, what will it mean? It will mean my marriage will break, and he loves his wife. The prospect of that is horrifying. He will hurt the person he loves the most. And then also children. But then he says, but the children grow up and they go away, and so we can ignore them. And then he says, well, maybe we should keep the affair, we could keep the affair a secret. So what will be the consequence of that? It would mean having to lie, and lies will be piled upon more lies, and soon he'll forget the difference between truth and a lie, and he'll become an inauthentic human being. And so maybe he says he should not have an affair. But then he says if he does not have an affair, what will be the consequence of that? The consequence of that will be that he might resent for the rest of his life his chance for one thrilling moment of happiness, and he might end up as a shriveled, old, mean man resenting the world. So the point here of this thinking, here of this thinking that is going through his mind is that does he betray his wife or does he betray himself? And this is the classic conflict between karma and dharma. We normally know about dharma. We are reminded of it every day, our duty to others. But we forget that we also have a duty to ourselves. And so this is a book which, this is giving you a sense that I'm not judging this fictional narrator. I'm just presenting to you the normal kind of dilemmas. And you know, the Mahabharata says somewhere that that this is karma is the part of the melancholic human condition. There is no answer in this case. Businessmen talk about win-win. Well, this is a lose-lose. Whatever action he takes, he will lose. So there is a cost in being alive. But it is important, nobody has actually pointed this out, that karma is a duty to yourself. And that is one of the ways. This was, I think, to give you a sense of how the book moves on.
Well, it's certainly a very useful and unique way of looking at karma that's just well beyond just physical expression of desire. I'm going to put a question to both of you. One is a book of historical documentation along with contemporary developments to it, and Gurcharan, your book, Karma, using the fictional mode, is also talking about relevance of old ideas of desire onto our lives today. Looking around, we know that in India there has been a sexual revolution very rapidly, particularly in the last 10, 12 years. We're openly talking about adultery, homosexuality, transgender. We are talking about the expression of so-called forbidden love. As Madhavi said, we are not being judgmental, we are just being descriptive. But the sexual revolution in the country has brought about a lot of thinking about desire and about tradition. So Madhavi, first you and then Gurcharan. In what way does your book relate to the sexual revolution that is happening and the current topics that we are discussing?
You know, one of my favorite posters that I have up on my office door is an image of Ismat Chugtai writing in the 1940s. And she's being told about the sexual revolution, well, 1950s, 60s. She's being told about the sexual revolution in the US. And she says, what sexual revolution, right? We've been there centuries ago. So when people talk about the sexual revolution in India the last 10 to 20 years, I'm a bit skeptical because if anything, I think actually we're regressing a little bit and we've been far more revolutionary in the past. And I think we need to keep this in mind very clearly, that we have had multiple versions, and Mala, you yourself listed some of those versions right now, multiple versions, multiple stories, multiple lived realities of desire for centuries in this civilizational land. And when I mean India, I mean the Indian subcontinent, right? Not the borders that the British bestowed upon us, right? I mean, I talk about the entire Indian subcontinent. We have been extremely revolutionary, and this is something Gurcharan said as well, for a long time. What is happening now, and you mentioned homosexuality, for instance, which is, of particular interest to me, and the entire 377 case was of particular interest to me. What is happening now, I fear, is that in the name of sexual revolution, we are becoming a little more regressive. So just to give you an example about 377, which I think was a fantastic decision by the Supreme Court, and one that we need to welcome fully, wholly, and embrace entirely. But I also think that legally, it was a bit of a lost opportunity, because as you all might remember, Section 377 that was read down by the Supreme Court prohibits, quote, carnal acts against the order of nature. Right? For whatever reason, Victorian prudery, lack of time, lack of imagination, they actually do not specify what those acts might be. Now later, when judges have sort of dwelt on that phrase, carnal acts against the order of nature, interpreted it variously, but inevitably the interpretation becomes sexual acts that do not conduce to reproduction. Now, I don't need to remind everyone in this room that every one of us who is sexually active, in fact, indulge in such acts on a daily basis. So making 377 then about homosexuality allows us to say, this is about those people, rather than to say, this is about every single one of us. We all need to be invested in this fight. This is not a fight of a tiny majority, it is a fight of every one of us. And I think if the legal battle for 377 had highlighted that carnal acts against the order of nature is in fact what we have called sex in this subcontinent for centuries, that would have been a much more politically and ethically potent position from which to approach this. And so that for me then becomes a sign of both the sort of slight regressiveness, right? Because now homosexuality as a category, as an identifiable category, is actually something that we've inherited from an entire discourse of sexual politics in the West. But it has become now the label that we think of as revolutionary, rather than drawing on an understanding of sexuality that affects all of us.
So you know, you hit a very good, you hit the nerve. Yeah. And I think one of the questions most Indians ask themselves is, here we had such an open culture, and how did we become so prudish? And you know, I'll give you an example of this open way we had. The Mahabharata is always wonderful to go back to. And the Mahabharata, in the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira asks Bhishma. Yudhishthira says, you know, tell me, who gets pleasure more, a man or a woman in sex? And Bhishma says, well, you know, you can't answer that question unless you've been a man and a woman. And so he says, yes, there was a king, Bhangashvana. And this king, for half his life, was a man, and then for the second half of his life, he was a woman. And because he was a good person, at the end of his life, he is given a choice. How would you like to be born as in your next life? Would you like to be born as a man or a woman? And he says, as a woman. And people say, are you crazy? As a man, you're a king, you could be emperor. And why do you want to be a woman? And he says, well, because women enjoy sex more. And then he explains. Then he says, it's not just sex. He says women have a much richer emotional life. They have, you know, E.M. Forster, in his, he wrote a book called 2 Cheers for Democracy. And people asked him, well, why didn't you give 3 cheers for democracy? And he said, because I reserved 3 cheers for the private life, for the emotional life. And so I think what the message here basically, and well, I was illustrating to you the openness with which these people are talking. And another quick example, Mala, that is, there's the young man named Shwetaketu, who we know was a hero in the Upanishads. This young man sees his mother go out with a different man every night, and he doesn't like it. And so the third night, he looks at his father, and his father doesn't seem to mind. And then he gets angry the fourth night, and he says, doesn't it bother you that your wife goes out with a different man every night and comes back in the morning? And the father says, son, but this is how the way the world is. Human beings are polygamous. And Shwetaketu, of course, doesn't becomes a powerful man and makes the law of monogamy. And so, and of course, this is borne out now by evolutionary biology that we were polygamous at one time. The point I was illustrating was actually the point that you were also making, that we tend to blame we had a very open culture which became prudish. People tend to blame either Islam or the British, mostly the British, Victorians. And in fact, that's not true. That from the beginning, we had two strands in our civilization. We had the karma optimists who raised karma to the goal of life and created a god Karma, and we are going to change Valentine's Day to Karma Deva Devas. And then we also had the karma pessimists, the rishis, the yogis, and the Buddha, the Jains. They were all for celibacy. And in this clash of karma optimists and karma pessimists was a great compromise, which was karma realists. And karma realists said basically, sex is all right as long as it's within marriage. And this was enacted in the Dharma Shastras.
I mean, if I can just sort of add to that a little bit. I keep joking that when I was writing this book, I tried really hard not to blame the British for everything. And I didn't always succeed. But there is no doubt that with the coming of British colonialism, a certain kind of moral prudery crept into our systems of thought that had been fairly unheard of before. But before we sort of pat ourselves too much on the back for having been so wonderfully liberated for so many centuries, in all honesty, the British were able to mine a fault line in Indian society that to this day continues to be a big thorn in our side. And that, of course, I'm referring to the caste system. This entire idea of purity and impurity was already deeply entrenched in our midst. And what the British were able to do in their extremely clever and powerful way was to put pressure on that fault line. And so the fault line that had existed for a long time but had not always interfered with this open demonstrations of sexuality suddenly was used to shut down, and this idea of purity came to mean much, much more, especially in terms of desire. Which is why when we have a version of that today in our midst, in this idea of swachhata or purity or Swachh Bharat and all these initiatives, I would say we need to be very cautious and careful about that. Because this notion of purity has always led us into trouble, and we need to be very aware of the troubles it has caused us in the past and continues to cause us in the present.
Indeed, very thoughtfully put by both Madhavi and Gurcharan. And I'd like to add a little footnote to that seems that our philosophical traditions in India have been dialogic. So if there is the Kamasutra, there is also the Manusmriti. And if we are talking about cross-gendering, transgendering, etc., there are beautiful stories which also bring that into question. Gurcharan, you also talk about the Geet Govind, and that's something, how can one not talk about the Geet Govind when we are having a session on desire? Absolutely. Just finished a book on Radha with Namita Gokhale, and one of the essays talks deeply at the cross-dressing episode, that Radha tells Krishna, how will you ever understand what it is to be a woman? So he says, okay, let's try. You wear my clothes, I wear your clothes. And let's see whether we can start thinking about each other. So yes, there are beautiful descriptions of how they exchange the clothes and all the paraphernalia and adornment that goes with it, and Krishna asks for mehendi on his hands and all that. At the end of it all, Radha says, look, you can try as hard as you like. You will never, ever enter the emotion of a woman in vireha, when she has been left alone and in sorrow. That is particular to a woman. Now, that's one point of view. Maybe a man's viraha is different and somebody else has written about it. But what I enjoyed very much in both the books and from whatever reading that comes to us of Indian traditions, mythologies, etc., the correlation with the past and the present that both these books bring is very significant.
And Mala, I want to take up the point, excellent point that Madhavi made, and I'm so glad you mentioned the Gita Govinda, because it's curious, I found when I was researching for my book, that romantic love was born on 3 continents at the same time in the 12th century. In the West, it was expressed in the great story of Tristan and Isolde, and that is the time when you had the chivalric tradition, the troubadours, etc. In the Islamic world, there's a wonderful story about Laila and Majnu, which is the first great romantic story by Nizami in what is today modern-day Iran. And in East India, you have the Gita Govinda. And what makes Gita Govinda, and of course, Gita Govinda, as you were saying, has been sanitized by the bhakti saints, etc. But in the original poem of Jayadeva, if there's one book on desire that you should read, it is this one. Because you never know whether it's human love or divine love, which is love of Krishna and Radha. And the amazing thing is that the sort of sanitized interpretation after Chaitanya and all, and even in Sufism and so on, is that this is the soul's yearning for the divine. But in fact, in the Gita Govinda, it is the sorry, I got distracted by this person, but it is not only Radha's love for Krishna, but it is Krishna's love, not for all human creatures, the God's love for all human creatures, and especially for the 40,000 gopis that he dances with in Ras Leela, which lasts for one Brahma night, which is equal to 4.5 billion human years. Right. But it is also a love of Krishna for one woman, and she's married. So it's adulterous love of God for a devotee.
Right. I mean, I just add a footnote to the footnote very quickly.
And then we'll go into the questions.
First, I wanted to point out the adulterousness of the love, which I think is very important to think about. But I also want to add that the entire Sufi tradition in India is drenched in this kind of cross-dressing that you were talking about, Mala. This, if you read Bulle Shah's poetry, which is just so hauntingly beautiful, he repeatedly talks about dressing himself in bangles, in skirts, and dancing for Shah Inayat, his peer. Right. If you read Khusro's poetry for Nizamuddin, and a particularly poignant poem is when Nizamuddin has died, and Khusro says, just scatter your hair on the bed and don't bother getting up because night has fallen upon the world. And the sense of cross-dressing, of being an intensely beloved companion, takes us, and this is between two men, takes us out of the register of what we now recognize as heterosexuality, takes us out of the register of what we now think of as just sort of, Hinduism, and points to a really syncretic, multiple, various, plural histories of desire that the Indian subcontinent is heir to, and that we must never forget because it's a lot of fun.
And Nanak says...
No, we'll just take questions.
Nanak said about the bangles.
We'll take it. I'm sure there's so much more that we can hear from our wonderful speakers, but 10 minutes for questions, please. Request the volunteers to quickly pass the mics around and keep it very short. Let's get as many voices in as possible. Yes, let's start here.
Hi again. So I just want to go back to the point about us being in a conservative society at this point. You know, the more I hear the conversations here, there's obviously we were a liberated society, but how should we be reconciling with this? As a younger generation, how should I think about this, or does it stay in literature and art?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, so thank you for asking it. And it's also a difficult question. And I think one thing I would like to highlight, and this is also a title of one of Gurcharan's earlier books, is the question of difficulty. And we need to, I think one of our big failings in this day and age is that we're not comfortable with difficulty. We're not comfortable with complexity. We sort of want to rush to an answer. We want to rush to sort of have 100 likes for whatever post we have posted. And that kind of shrinkage of time and space and energy does not conduce to staying with difficulty. And so for me, really, and for instance, if you just take one example of the Kamasutra, the whole point of the Kamasutra is that developing desire requires time and patience and effort, and you have to learn 64 different arts in order to be considered a good lover. So the idea of today, and why I say we might be actually more prudish today, is that we want a certain definite answer. Who am I? Who are you? And we want those answers to be set in stone, never thrown open to question, never thrown open to difficulty. And so, to sort of give you a short version, which hopefully will lead to a longer version, I think we need to re-embrace a sense of complexity, re-embrace a sense of delight in complexity.
And just quick one. I think the Kama Sutra, we make the mistake of thinking it's a book about sexual positions. It's in fact a book of manners. It says, for example, if you want to be socially successful, talk about the other person. Don't talk about yourself.
Which is so the opposite of what we're doing now, today, right?
If you want to be, don't speak in Sanskrit. Speak in the language of the other person. And if you want to be a good lover, give her pleasure first before you think of your pleasure.
And it also talks about women's pleasure, by the way, giving pleasure.
Go ahead, please. Yeah, and some mics
Hello.
here. There's somebody here. Maybe I'll take that one.
Madhavi spoke about the public and the private in the parks and the bushes. Yeah. So being a PPP expert from Finance Ministry, I think this is a nice public-private partnership in the parks. Now, coming to Mr. Das, like Plato in his Republic says, there are three universal fetters of men: wine, women, and wealth. So don't you think that we have to go for that higher goal in life, despite all these, rather than elevating these as goals of life?
Well, yes, I mean, that is one of the things that Plato says. Plato also says that we were at one, in Aristophanes says that in the Symposium. He says that we were at one time double the size of what we are, and we threatened the gods, and the gods cut us down into two, and so there are two halves of each person, and love consists in searching for the other half of the person. Of course, what you said also is correct, because there's a ladder that Plato lays out that of love, that if you love one person, then from that love, you can learn to love others and love your neighborhood, love your city, love your country, and love the humanity, all these circles.
And in those divided people, it could be a man looking for a man, a woman looking for a woman, a man looking for a woman. So this was thousands of years ago. So when we pride ourselves on being sort of so liberated today, we need to think back to a time when this was taken absolutely for granted.
So coming from Plato to Tolstoy, Anna Karenina died where Draupadi lived. So basically, Anna Karenina could not differentiate or got too attached. So just the question, just a very off question, that what about desire and the detachment in the desire? Probably that led Draupadi love 5 men equally and also desire for Karna.
Well, this is a very intricate one, but yes, I think Anna Karenina's tragedy, it's one of the great novels of our times, of the last 200 years. And I'm actually make use of this to make, the narrator is making use of this to illustrate a number of lessons. But I think we don't have time to discuss those lessons right now. Go and read my book.
There's somebody in the back. You know, people at the back often get left out, so I'm looking out for those people. Yes, please, go ahead.
So I have a question on the complexities around Krishna. He kind of changed the laws of nature during the battle. B is that he's obviously not monogamous. And C is that he was having an extramarital relationship, which is now immortal and sacred, according to all our texts, right? Yeah. So kind of a question to Gurcharan as well as to Madhavi about, did he ever not have these karmic issues in his mind? What kind of an example was Lord Krishna? And the last part, this was the first cougar relationship, because she was 3 years older than Krishna. And that has now become a widely spread phenomenon, the cougar phenomenon. So
Yes.
how do we understand this in our context?
Well, that's very interesting. You say she was older. And you know, until when Napoleon married in the 18th century, and he married Josephine. And the marriage was declared illegal because she was 3 years older. So it's very, very recent times we have liberated ourselves. But as far as your question, do you want to... just remind me about your question again. Krishna, yes. Yes, I think Krishna is one of the most fascinating characters, I think, in our mythology. I find him far more interesting than Rama. And I think that Krishna evolves as a god. The Krishna of the Gita is very different from the Krishna of the Bhagavad Purana. And the notion of romantic love that enters into the whole thing. And it's very interesting how actually bhakti became an expression of romantic love in India.
And I'll just add to that very quickly. Krishna is a very interesting god. I agree with Gurcharan, much more interesting than Rama. And again, it's an index of our political times that Rama is getting elevated because we are living in extremely sexually prudish times. And if you look historically at Krishna worshippers, traditionally a Krishna worshipper, be it male or female, always has to describe himself or herself as a woman. That there is a way in which, and historically and traditionally again, Krishna worshippers always dress as women and narrate themselves as women, which you will never see with Rama worshippers, right? Rama worshippers are all about 56 inch ki chhati or whatever it is. That there is a sense of masculinity tied up with the Rama cult, which is absolutely the opposite of Krishna, which unfortunately is why in this day and age we're seeing a certain demotion of Krishna and an elevation of Rama, which again, at the risk of repeating myself, we need to be cautious about.
We'll take one last question from this very eager member of the audience. Just a very quick one, please. And that will be the last one. We just have 2 minutes more.
Hello, always a delight to hear from the three of you. My question is to Madhavi ma'am. Right from the time when Eve Sedgwick was writing about queer theory and queer studies, to this time when you're writing about it and you're doing your research work extensively, how do you think we have moved in terms of learning, academically and otherwise?
I mean, I think this is to just sort of bring the question back to our panel, there is a way in which I think when we think about desire, and I think both Gurcharan's book and my book do this very persuasively. When we think about desire, we actually can't think in terms of rigid categories. We can't think in terms of rigid separation between good and bad, between right and wrong, between what should be done and should not be done. And so this sense of, I mean, I think Gurcharan's book does an excellent job of talking about the many debates within Hindu traditions, where, you know, it's not just one point of view or the other. I am very insistent in my book on thinking about how desire always overflows categories, right? Every time we sort of say, I am X or you are Y, the next day you might find that your desire is moving in a slightly different direction. So I think if there's anything that we have learned about desire, is that it is extremely difficult to categorize it and to contain it. Because in order to be the potent force that it has to, in fact, trouble categories. It has to, in fact, put pressure on identities. It has to be able to tell us what we think we are, we might not be. And just to end on one small example, which both Gurcharan and I use in our books, the Kamasutra sort of sets out by saying, let me give you the many categories of human beings that can engage in sexual pleasure, and, you know, women who look like this or men who look like that. And then Vatsyayana says very clearly, you know, I've given you all these categories, but actually, and this is my favorite quote from him, he says, passion knows no order. That there is, I'm giving you these categories, but what I'm writing about are things that defy categorization itself. And so I would say, sort of as a final thing, that if we are to think about desire, we need to hold on to the fact that it might be slippery, that we might not get certain answers and certainty, and that's not a bad thing.
My favorite quote from the Kama Sutra is that every man sees a beautiful woman, desires her. Every woman sees a handsome man, desires him. But after some consideration, they back off. And the other quote is, if you are kissed, kiss back.
And also, of course, he also talks about men who are women, women who are men, and that kind of sort of multiplicities of desire. So go ahead and enjoy yourselves. And have a
Thank
good
you,
time.
Gurcharan. Thank you, Madhavi. Thank you.